All right, now that we have been familiar with Mrs. Cattleguard's kitchen, this idea where you can take and blend a few things together, mix a few things together, and see what the outcome is. Now, Mrs. Cattleguard was in there mixing up some rather weird drinks, and the pink one there was described as being a little bit heretical. I believe it was a strawberry yoo-hoo or something crazy like that. But there's a serious question. Are things from the past mixable with things today? Can you mix them? Can you integrate things from the past till today's time? Are they still relevant? So one of the ways that I want us to talk about the idea of mixing things from the past to today is this concept of original sin and the question of whether or not people are inherently good or originally bad. In fact, one could make the case that the old arguments that in humanity there is original sin, that this is the same thing as saying people are inherently bad. So let's talk about this. Is the concept of original sin the same thing as asking are people inherently bad? Amanda, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so those conversations, obviously we can make connections and say they're very similar. I would say, though, that they're not exactly the same thing. Not in the sense that evil and good are somehow a old ancient concept that are no longer relevant. They definitely are. And the idea of inherent or original sin is definitely a relevant conversation as well. So they're still relevant, but there's a little distinctions between the two conversations. And that, in my opinion, would be simply that when we talk about if someone is inherently good or evil, we're often limiting free will. We're kind of saying that they either are A or B, and there's not much of another option. But if we start with the concept of original sin, we're starting in kind of a different place. But even really then, that's not the good beginning of the conversation. Really, we have to go just a little bit further back. And when we say a little bit further back, we mean to the beginning of creation. And we find that God creates people in God's image. And this is where we all start. Now, this is different than saying we're inherently good, because the image of God is an image that is creative, but can choose. And so there's not kind of this force that's forcing us to do good or bad, but simply that we have the ability to choose. Now, that image, of course, was corrupted in the fall. It was broken. And so now we have a choice. Do we live into the image of God that we were created, or do we continue brokenness? And so there's, I think, a slight distinction in that conversation than inherently good or evil. So that's kind of where I would draw the lines.
All right, so I just want to reaffirm one thing that you pointed out there, Pastor Amanda. You were talking about how God created humanity in his image, and God is a being of will. God chooses to be good, but if he creates humanity in his image, then we ourselves also are beings of will, and we may choose to be good, or we may choose to be bad. Am I correct?
Yes, of course. And so this is then also when we read of the story of the fall itself is not God tricking Adam and Eve to be sinners so he can kick them out of a nice garden, but it's God allowing that choice to happen. But that choice was not necessarily something that had to happen. It was, again, a free will choice. And so there was not, again, a force saying that they had to do A or B. They simply were allowed to choose between the two of them.
One of the things that I think of when I think of the conversation of free will is the ability to choose between things which are fundamentally different. And we were having a conversation about this before the program, Amanda, and I know you had pointed out something that I thought was quite good. Just because things are fundamentally different doesn't necessarily mean that one is always bad or one is always good. It could be that one thing is good and another thing is better. It could be that two things are potentially good but are just wildly unrelated to one another. And free will is something really where people do have this opportunity to make choices in their life. God calls us in a certain direction, but there still is an element of free will that we have as we are created in the image of God. Well, let's move gears just a little bit. Let's shift into another gear and talk about this idea of whether or not people are inherently good. Because I know in our conversation as we were preparing for this, Amanda, you had said that this in and of itself is also a bit of a wrong question.
Right, because it really kind of sets us up for the wrong conclusion. We can, whether we conclude with we're inherently evil or whether we conclude with we're inherently good, again, we're kind of preconditioning people or predestinating people's actions. And without a doubt, we can look at human history and say, there were some times people did some great stuff. They worked towards some great things. And then more often than that, we can look at human history and be like, left to their own devices, humanity sucks. They pick awful options. They're prone to destruction. And kind of this, even looking into creation, this movement towards entropy. But again, then that makes us very pessimistic, and we have to ask, where is hope in that? And we always have to start in a place where grace precedes brokenness. So even when we talk about original sin, before there was original sin, there was prevenient grace. So that's kind of, again, the conversation has to move in that direction, because if we don't have a solid foundation, we're going to get into heresies that look a lot like truth, but they're not.
Well, I think you bring up some good things there. You brought up entropy. And entropy is this concept where everything in the universe, when left to its own resources, will kind of evolve towards chaos. Things sort of degenerate, they fall apart, and they're perpetually getting worse in some capacity. And before I share my thoughts on this, I wanted to see if you all have thoughts on this, Anthony included. What do we think about the connection between the history of the people of God talking about original sin and the concept of entropy that we now discuss in sort of modern philosophy and even modern physics and things of that nature? Did we see a connection between original sin and entropy?
I would say that considering that original sin is kind of like the gateway to start sinning much more, it's kind of like, from what I can tell, that once the original sin was committed, there was much more sin. And I think that falls into the law of entropy itself. It's, the start of that, boom, more and more chaos is going to ensue without discipline. And I think that the law of entropy is also really interesting because it really, really strengthens the idea of divine revelation, I guess, and the necessity that people have for that. Because without divine revelation, we do continue to go and head further into chaos, and that's where I don't want to say that's where our natural tendency is. People are chaotic, and we make good and bad decisions, but bad decisions tend to have a ripple effect, whereas good decisions, ripple effect, I don't think go as far. I mean, that's also according to the law of entropy.
That's for sure. Whenever somebody commits something, a sin that we can clearly define, like lying about something that you have done which is bad. For instance, if you go into a store and you lie that, no, I did not go in there and steal that $50 DVD player. I almost said $50 VCR, and then I realized I was going to give away like what time I grew up. But say you go inside in Walmart, and I will say VCR. You go in there and you steal a VCR on some cassette tapes. You may lie about this, but then somebody can go out to your car and be like, you know what? I looked in there. I seen that you have Jurassic Park 1. Very good movie in there. I see the stolen tape, and I see the VCR that you've got in there. Like, logically, to lie, you are disconnecting yourself from reality in a way that reality doesn't match. It's an unreliable account, because if somebody seen you do that and they report it to the police and they pull you over down the road, no matter what you say to them, if they look inside and they see the stolen goods, and then they have also the cassette tape from the store where you stole it, they can verify that what you're saying is untrue. So it is one of those things where it builds up a lot more chaos around it when that happens. But back to the question about the relationship between entropy and original sin, I think another point that is worth making is that it doesn't have to be an entropy situation. Again, back to Amanda's logic, I don't want to set people up for the false dichotomy, which takes us to bad conclusions. People certainly have choices, and we can choose the call of God, or we can choose a different path. And one of the things that we have said a lot around here at Kingdom of the Logos is that without discipline, the pathology will win. In other words, the worst case scenario will oftentimes win if people don't have discipline to fight against that. If people do not choose a different route, then things like entropy can come in. And I think one of the things which is interesting about the concept of original sin is this idea that human nature, whenever people come together in some sort of aggregation, there may be some people who are very bad. You may have some antisocial actors who are doing vicious things to one another. You may have some people who are moderately bad, some who are generally good, and maybe even some who are like Saint Angela Merici, who we were talking about in our recent Hot Not or Sanctified, who in the midst of the world where they see a lot of poverty and suffering, they say, well, I'm going to go up and build schools and do some great things. They answer the call of God. You get people who choose a lot of different things. And the concept of original sin, I think, is a reminder to us all that if we do not discipline ourselves, that if we do not make efforts to choose well, then we can find ourselves making bad choices and set into effect some different things that are more like entropy. We can set some chaotic things and some things of suffering in motion in our world. Amanda, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think as you were talking about, like, why does it seem like the chaotic option or the bad option creates this giant ripple, as Anthony was saying, of bad things, and then when we do a good thing, it doesn't seem to impact the world as much. And I think then that's where we go almost, this might be a little side tangent, but the difference between kind of a good action and a holy action. And what I mean by that, there's a difference between something that's just done that's good and something that's done empowered by the Holy Spirit, that's done because of a relationship with God. And that's because there are some great things people can do that are disconnected from the Christian faith, that are disconnected from a relationship with God, and they do good things, and I don't want to downplay that so much, but they don't have the resources, they don't have the backing to really make an impact in the world, because all they're doing is kind of a Band-Aid. It's very shallow. Versus when you connect yourself with the story of God, with the people of God, there's something much more powerful, that the nature of things are changing. That movement towards entropy, that brokenness, that sinful nature, whatever you want to call it, that mess of our world is being transformed into something better. But it can only be transformed into something better if it's being transformed by God. Simply doing something good is not going to transform it, right? So that's, I think, as we look at our world and its mess and its brokenness, and we're like, why is this not changing? Why is it still a mess? It is getting better, not in this kind of humanistic sense of if we can, just force everyone to do the right thing, then we'll all be good. But that as we surrender ourselves, our wisdom, our will to God, and are transformed individually, we join a community that is changing the world.
Well, I want to add one thing to that. You were saying you see things which happen separated from the church, which aren't necessarily bad. You see things that you could even say are objectively quite good. One of the things that I also think is quite interesting, and you find this both within the secular community and the Christian community, is people are not always very self-aware of the origins of their own personal convictions. You find this all the time. You might have people who may claim to be atheistic, but yet they have Christian generations that come before them, or they're raised in the West, which has largely been shaped by the Christian virtues. And even within the church, sometimes we don't even recognize when the Holy Spirit is convicting us to do things. And it's interesting how God uses the choice of good in the world around us. But to Amanda's point, she's quite right, and we don't want to downplay the fact that people do generally do good, but there is another level of good that we can achieve when we recognize the Christian virtues which we're called to. We recognize that God has called us to a universally applicable moral code that we can take and apply anywhere in our lives. When we take and apply that in our lives, we move not just from doing things which matter in this moment in time, but we really elevate ourselves to things which have eternal value. And I'm not just speaking about the concepts of heaven or hell, but the Christian virtues which have been passed down through the ages. They really are universally applicable in the past, in the present, and in the future. And being able to continue on those traditions are just absolutely fantastic. Well, let's go ahead and wrap up this conversation. Any final thoughts, Amanda or Anthony?
No.
No?
I think that we've concluded.
Well, that was a rather brisk no. We'll spare the jokes of the punitive measures taking against Anthony for refusing to give input there, but all the same, Anthony's actually quite great. We've got a lot of new technology in here. Anyways, and we thank you for your support. We thank you for spending time with us here at Kingdom of the Logos. If you've enjoyed our program, please do share our content. You can help us out so much by sharing our content. You can find our content on, of course, YouTube, Facebook. You can find us on a few other places. You can follow me on Twitter at jdillonproctor. If you would really want to help us out, you can just grab a link to our content, share it to your friends, your family. That will help us out tremendously. We have a Patreon set up where we're improving our studio. We've got new microphones going on now to really improve our quality. And again, we thank you for all that you can do for us. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, that is found at patreon.com/kingdomofthelogos. And on that, find Christian virtues, apply them in your life, and have a blessed day.